What are the different types of the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to establish this act of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be in the state of dhikr of Allah? It's by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there are so many different types of dhikr. Dhikr is not just one type or one act of dhikr that people think when we say dhikr. People think that you would say SubhanAllah, Alhamdulillah as the dhikr, which is one of the types of dhikr, of course, but there are more than this. One of which is to recite Qur'an. And there are verses, a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that shows the virtue of reciting the Qur'an. And the Qur'an and reciting the Qur'an, the highest level of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Qur'an being the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So reciting the Qur'an with every letter is 10 rewards, as the Prophet ﷺ said. So to recite Qur'an in specific times at all times. There is the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at specific times, specific places, specific situations, in the morning and in the evening, before going to sleep, entering the masjid, leaving the masjid, and so on. And we learned that from the authentic hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and the books of adhkar that compiled according to these types of chapters and places and things like that. And also to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making dua, invoking Allah, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in sujood in the salah, making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the last part of the night between the adhan and the iqamah, when it rains, at all times during the Jumu'ah salah, at all times a person raise their hands and making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is one of the great acts of worship and great acts of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Learning the religion, learning the deen, attending the gatherings of knowledge. When a person yatlub al-ilm, when someone is seeking the knowledge of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the highest level of dhikr, even as the ulama they say, if it's either to seek knowledge at a particular time or to make nafl salah, optional salah, seeking knowledge is a priority, is more virtue. It doesn't mean that we neglect the optional salah, but in a specific time, in a specific situation that a person is engaged in. So all of these things are types of dhikr of Allah, enjoining good and forbidding evil, saying kind and nice words to one's parents, making the remembrance of Allah in any gatherings that we are in. Whenever the name of the Prophet ﷺ is mentioned, we make salah on the Prophet ﷺ. Khitamul al-majlis, whenever we end a gathering, we say the dua that the Prophet ﷺ taught us to expiate for the sins that might have occurred in a gathering or in one speech and so on. So all of this basically comprises the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the different levels of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you add to this at all times for a person to be engaged in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as you see, the life of the believers is always in the state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how we increase our Iman. This is how we establish the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we are upon these different types of adhkar, remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.